There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a man when everything he has ever built, every nail he drove, every dollar he saved, every prayer he prayed at 5 in the morning before the rest of the world was awake, gets taken from him in a single day, not by a stranger, not by some faceless corporation, but by the one person on this earth who looked him in the eyes on the most important day of his life and said the words, "I do." That silence is not the silence of peace. That is the silence of a man who has just realized that the floor he was standing on was never real. And tonight we are going to tell you the story of Marcus Williams, a man who built a $30 million empire from nothing in a city that did not make it easy for a black man to succeed. A man who gave everything he had to his family, to his business, to his community, and then watched his own wife use that trust like a weapon to send him to federal prison for crimes he never committed. Now here is what you need to understand before we get into this story, because I know some of you right now are thinking, you've heard something like this before. You have not heard this. What Denise Williams did to her husband was not a moment of weakness. It was not a desperate decision made under pressure. What Denise Williams did was a calculated, years-long operation, the kind of thing that required planning, patience, and a coldness that most people do not have. She built shell companies in her maiden name. She forged her husband's signature on financial documents hundreds of times. She paid a witness to lie on the stand. She sat in that courtroom every single day of Marcus's trial, in the front row, and she did not shed one tear. And while Marcus Williams was escorted out of that courtroom in handcuffs, headed to a federal prison in Georgia to serve 22 years, Denise Williams walked out of those same courthouse doors, got into a car service, and rode straight to the Midtown Atlanta penthouse she had purchased with his money. Stay with me, because this story is going to take you to places you did not expect. And the ending, I promise you, is something that not even the people inside that courtroom saw coming. Before we go any further into this story, I want you to understand the 3 questions that are going to drive everything you're about to hear. The first question is this: how does a woman steal $30 million from her own husband, engineer his federal conviction, and walk free for years without a single person in the justice system catching it? That is not an accident. That is architecture. The second question is this: if Marcus Williams was innocent, why did it take nearly 3 years inside a federal prison before anyone with power started listening? And the third question, the one that is going to sit with you long after this video ends, is whether the justice that eventually came was truly justice, or whether it was just the system cleaning up its own mess and calling it a win. Because there is a difference between justice and correction, and by the time this story is over, you are going to have a very clear opinion about which one Marcus Williams actually received. Now, before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the story we are about to tell you tonight is one of the most extraordinary cases of betrayal, wrongful conviction, and long-delayed justice that we have ever covered. And it all begins in southeast Atlanta, Georgia, in the summer of 1987. Marcus Allen Williams was born on August 9th, 1961, in a part of southeast Atlanta that people drove through but rarely stopped in, Jonesboro Road, a stretch of pavement that in those days meant corner stores, block parties in the summer, and the kind of poverty that does not announce itself loudly. It just sits there, quiet and patient, in the background of everything you try to do. His mother, Gloria Williams, worked as a home health aide for 31 years. His father, Raymond Sr., worked construction until his back gave out, and after that he drove a city bus until the day he retired. There was not a lot of money in that house, but there was a great deal of dignity. Marcus grew up watching his father come home tired, watching his mother stretch a grocery budget the way only certain women know how to do, and he made a decision somewhere around the age of 14 that he was going to build something. He did not know what yet, but he knew it was going to be real. He knew it was going to last, and he knew it was going to mean something. By the time Marcus was 22 years old, he was working construction full-time, swinging a hammer on job sites across Atlanta 6 days a week. He was not managing anything. He was not in an office. He was in the dirt, in the Georgia heat, learning every single thing about how buildings go up and what makes them stand. He took night classes at Atlanta Metropolitan College, business administration, basic accounting, contract law. He read every book he could find about entrepreneurship, about minority-owned business development, about how government contracts worked. Because Marcus Williams had identified something that most people around him had not, that the city of Atlanta was growing, that growth required construction, and that the contracts being issued for that construction were, in large part, going to companies that did not look like him. He intended to change that. And in 1991, with $12,000 he had saved over 4 years, Marcus Williams registered the paperwork for Williams Construction and Development, LLC. He had 2 employees, 1 truck, and a belief in himself that looking back was either extraordinary courage or extraordinary stubbornness. Probably both. What Marcus built over the next 2 decades was not luck. It was not a windfall. It was not the result of who his family knew or what school he attended. Marcus Williams' construction grew because Marcus Williams worked harder than everyone around him and delivered better results than anyone expected. By 1998, he had secured his first city contract, a road resurfacing project worth $800,000. He brought it in on time and under budget. The city noticed. By 2003, Williams Construction had a workforce of 47 employees, a fleet of 12 vehicles, and a portfolio of completed projects that included public school renovations, city infrastructure work, and residential developments across Fulton and DeKalb counties. By 2008, the company was clearing $7 million annually. And by 2012, at the peak of Marcus Williams's career, Williams Construction and Development was generating over $30 million a year in revenue. From a boy who watched his daddy come home with dirt on his boots every night and decided that was not the end of the story. That was just the beginning. People in Atlanta's business community knew Marcus Williams. They respected him. He hired from the neighborhood. He coached Little League on Saturday mornings. He paid his taxes, tithed at his church, and showed up when people needed him. His business partner of 15 years, a man named Jerome Davis, who grew up on the same block, who had known Marcus since they were both 12 years old, said in an interview years later that Marcus Williams was the most honest man he had ever worked with in his life. Jerome said, and I want you to hear these words carefully, Marcus did not have a dishonest bone in his body. Not one. I watched that man turn down opportunities that could have made him millions because something about the deal felt wrong to him. That is who Marcus Williams was. That is the man who is about to get destroyed. Marcus Williams met Denise Carter in October of 2001 at a business development gala hosted by the Atlanta Urban League. Denise was 34 years old. She had a master's degree in business administration from Spelman College. She had worked in financial management for a regional bank for 8 years, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that serious people recognize immediately. Marcus said later that what struck him first was not how she looked, though she was a beautiful woman, but how she spoke. He said she walked up to him at that event, introduced herself, and within 10 minutes was asking him specific, intelligent questions about his company's capital structure, that no one at a cocktail party had ever asked him before. He said it felt like being seen for the first time. Not Marcus the guy from the block, not Marcus the construction worker who got lucky, but Marcus the builder, Marcus the businessman, Marcus the vision. They were married on June 14, 2003, at Ebenezer Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue, the same church where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once preached. 220 guests. A reception at the Georgia Aquarium. Marcus wore a cream-coloured suit and could not stop smiling in a single photograph from that day. Denise joined Williams Construction as Chief Financial Officer 6 months after the wedding. On paper, it made perfect sense. She had the education, the experience, and the intimate knowledge of the business that came from being married to the man who ran it. Marcus trusted her with the books, with the banking relationships, with the financial reporting, with every account the company held. He trusted her the way you trust the person who shares your name and your bed and your future. He trusted her completely. And therein, as they say, lay the problem. People who knew them during those early years said the partnership seemed genuine. Denise worked hard. She was meticulous with the finances. She restructured the company's accounting systems, renegotiated vendor contracts, improved cash flow management. Marcus credited her publicly with helping the company reach $20 million in annual revenue. She gave speeches at business conferences. She mentored young women at Spelman. From the outside, the Williams family looked like exactly what black excellence is supposed to look like in America. Two educated, accomplished, self-made people building something real together. But Jerome Davis, who had an office 3 doors down from Denise and saw her every single day, said that somewhere around 2010, something changed. He could not name it at first. It was small things. The way she would minimize her computer screen when he walked into her office. The way certain financial questions that he brought to her would get answered in circles, never directly. The way she stopped suggesting that Marcus bring in an outside auditor for the annual review, which she had done every year since she joined the company, and started quietly resisting the idea instead. Jerome said he brought his concerns to Marcus twice in 2011. Both times Marcus looked at him with absolute certainty and said 4 words that would haunt every room in Jerome Davis's life for the next 7 years. He said, "That's my wife, Jerome. Here is what Denise Williams actually did. And I want you to pay close attention to this, because what she built was not a crime of opportunity. It was not a moment of weakness that spiraled. What Denise Williams constructed was a financial architecture, a system within a system that was specifically designed to redirect money out of Williams Construction and eventually destroy the man whose name was on the building. It started in 2010. Small amounts. Wire transfers of $15,000, $20,000 routed from Williams Construction operating accounts into a holding account that Denise had established at a separate bank under the name of a company called DLC Holdings LLC. DLC. Denise Laverne Carter. Her initials. Her maiden name. Registered in Delaware, which has among the most permissive business registration laws in the country, meaning you can form a corporation there without ever revealing who owns it. DLC Holdings had no employees. It had no operations. It had no purpose other than to receive money that did not belong to it. Over the next 3 years, Denise ran this same playbook with 4 additional shell companies, each one registered under a slightly different name, each one at a different financial institution, each one with just enough distance from the others to make the connections difficult to trace. The transfers grew larger over time, 50,000 here, 120,000 there. By 2012, the outflows had become so significant that they were affecting the company's actual cash position, its ability to make payroll, pay vendors, fund new project bids. When Marcus raised concerns about the company's cash flow, Denise had explanations ready. Delayed contract payments from the city, seasonal slowdowns in the construction cycle, vendor disputes that were being resolved. She was the CFO. She had the numbers. And Marcus, who had spent 30 years learning how to build things with his hands and his character, trusted the woman with the MBA and the spreadsheets to tell him the truth about the money. But the transfers alone were not going to be enough to sustain what Denise was planning, because at some point the money would be noticed. At some point someone would ask where it went, and when that day came, Denise needed the answer to already be in place. That answer was Marcus. From at least 2011 onward, according to the federal investigation that would eventually unravel her scheme, Denise Williams began systematically creating a parallel paper trail, a second reality that was designed to look like Marcus Williams had been stealing from his own company. She practiced his signature. Court documents later confirmed that forensic handwriting analysis found evidence she had studied and replicated his signature hundreds of times. She used his login credentials, which she had access to as CFO, to conduct transactions that she needed to appear as though they came from him. She created internal accounting records that showed Marcus authorizing wire transfers he had never seen, approving expenses he had never reviewed, directing funds to accounts he did not know existed. She also, and this is the part that requires you to stop for a moment and truly absorb it, she recruited an accomplice. His name was Gerald Watkins, 47 years old, a certified public accountant who had done contract work for Williams Construction for several years. A quiet man by all accounts, church-going, unremarkable, the kind of man who does not draw attention to himself in any room he enters. Gerald Watkins helped Denise establish 2 of the 5 shell companies. He helped her create the fraudulent secondary accounting system, a complete parallel set of books for Williams Construction that existed alongside the real ones and was specifically constructed to frame Marcus. In exchange for his work, Denise promised Watkins 15% of whatever they walked away with, 15% of $30 million. He agreed. And for the next 3 years, Gerald Watkins was Denise Williams's invisible partner, the man behind the machine that was slowly, methodically destroying an innocent man's life. By 2013, the machine was complete. The shell companies were in place. The fraudulent accounting records were in place. The forged documents were in place. A former employee of Williams Construction named Kevin Stills, a man who had been let go in a round of budget cuts in 2012 and had carried a grudge about it ever since, had been quietly approached and paid by Denise to serve as a cooperating witness in the event of a federal investigation. Stills would later testify under oath that he had personally witnessed Marcus Williams directing fraudulent financial transactions. It was a lie from beginning to end. But it was a credible lie told by a former company insider, and it was exactly what federal prosecutors needed to hear. The investigation into Williams Construction began in late 2013, triggered by an anonymous tip to the IRS's Financial Crimes Division. The tip came from an email account that was never definitively traced. But given everything that was later uncovered, the question of who sent that tip answers itself. On March 14, 2014, at 6:47 in the morning, federal agents knocked on the door of Marcus and Denise Williams's home in Cascade Heights, one of Atlanta's most established black neighborhoods. Marcus came to the door in his robe, coffee in hand, expecting nothing. He had no idea. He stood at his own front door while agents presented a warrant for his arrest on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. He stood there in silence for a moment, not because he was guilty, but because the human mind genuinely struggles to process information this far outside of its expected reality. And then he looked back into the house, because Denise was standing in the hallway. She was fully dressed. It was not yet 7 in the morning, and she was fully dressed, standing in the hallway of their home, watching her husband be arrested by federal agents. Marcus said later, years later, after everything had come out, that in that moment he looked at her expecting to see shock, or fear, or grief. He looked at her expecting to see his wife. What he saw instead, he said, was stillness. Not the stillness of someone frozen by horror. The stillness of someone watching a plan unfold exactly the way they always knew it would. Marcus Williams was handcuffed, walked out of his front door, and placed into a federal vehicle. His neighbors watched from their windows. His home, his $30 million company, his bank accounts, everything tied to Williams Construction, was immediately frozen by court order. And Denise Williams closed the front door of their house, went back inside, and called her attorney. Marcus Williams's federal trial began on October 6, 2015, in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. By that point, he had been sitting in a county detention facility for 18 months because his bail, set at $2 million, could not be paid. Every account he had access to had been frozen. His company was in receivership. His attorney was a public defender because the private attorneys he had retained early on had withdrawn when the retainer funds were exhausted. He sat at the defense table in a suit his mother had brought him, flanked by a young, overworked attorney who was juggling 11 other cases and had had exactly 3 weeks to review the prosecution's evidence, a stack of documents that filled 7 boxes. The prosecution's case was, on its surface, overwhelming. They had financial records showing transactions authorized from Marcus's accounts and his login credentials. They had the fraudulent internal accounting documents that Denise and Watkins had constructed over 3 years, all of which pointed to Marcus as the architect of the fraud. They had expert witnesses who testified about the financial irregularities in the company's books, irregularities that Denise herself had created. And they had Kevin Stills, who took the stand in a grey suit and told the jury, with complete calm, that he had personally been present when Marcus Williams had discussed redirecting company funds for personal use. Every word of it was fabricated. But Kevin Stills was convincing. He had specific details. He had dates. He had the kind of quiet, reluctant credibility that juries respond to. The man who does not want to be here, who is only telling the truth because he has no other choice. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On October 22, 2015, they returned a verdict of guilty on all 11 counts. Marcus Williams was convicted of wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and 4 additional charges related to financial crimes. His sentencing was scheduled for January of the following year. In January 2016, a federal judge sentenced Marcus Allen Williams to 22 years in federal prison. Marcus stood and heard those words without flinching. 22 years. He was 54 years old. He would be 76 before he was scheduled to be released. His mother, Gloria Williams, who was sitting in the 3rd row of the courtroom, covered her mouth with both hands and bent forward in her seat as if someone had struck her. His 3 children, Marcus Jr., Aaliyah, and baby of the family, Christopher, who was 19 at the time, sat in the row behind her. And Denise Williams sat in the front row on the prosecution's side and did not move a muscle. Jerome Davis did not believe the verdict for 1 single second. He never had. Jerome had known Marcus Williams for 42 years by the time of that trial. He had watched Marcus turn down corrupt deals. He had watched Marcus fire a project manager he liked because the man was padding invoices by small amounts, and Marcus said even small amounts of dishonesty grow into something you cannot manage. Jerome knew the man. And Jerome knew that the financial crimes described in that courtroom were not the actions of Marcus Williams. They were the actions of someone who had studied Marcus Williams very carefully and used that knowledge as a weapon. Jerome Davis spent every dollar he had in savings, $312,000, over the next 2 years funding a private investigation into what he believed had actually happened. He hired a forensic accountant named Sandra Okoye, a former IRS investigator with 20 years of financial crimes experience, who had retired to Atlanta and was doing private consulting work. Jerome handed her everything he had managed to collect before the company's records were seized: printouts, email threads, contract files, account statements. And he asked her one question. He said, "Tell me where the money actually went." Sandra Okoye spent 4 months going through those documents. 4 months of 14-hour days of building spreadsheets, of tracing transaction chains through layers of financial obfuscation that had been deliberately designed to be confusing. And what she found within those 4 months was the beginning of the truth. The first shell company, DLC Holdings, turned up in October of 2016. Sandra found the routing number associated with a Delaware-registered LLC that had received $14 million in wire transfers from Williams Construction over a 3-year period. She found that the company had been registered under the name Denise Laverne Carter. She found that the company had no employees, no physical address, no business operations of any kind. And she found that the transfers into DLC Holdings, all of them, had been executed from an IP address inside the Williams Construction offices on dates when Marcus was documented as being at a job site or in a meeting with city officials. Dates when Marcus could not have been the one sitting at that computer. While Sandra Okoye was building the financial case from the outside, something was happening inside the scheme that Denise Williams had not anticipated. Gerald Watkins was not getting paid. In the months following Marcus's conviction, Denise had begun the process of moving the money she had accumulated through the shell companies into a series of offshore accounts, including one in the Cayman Islands that Watkins had been involved in establishing. The arrangement, as Watkins understood it, was that once the money was safely offshore and the legal dust from Marcus's conviction had settled, Denise would transfer his 15%, a figure that by that point represented approximately $4.5 million, into a separate account he controlled. He waited. He waited for months. The transfers never came. Denise's phone calls became infrequent. Then they stopped entirely. And Gerald Watkins, who had spent 3 years helping frame an innocent man for crimes that man never committed, began to understand that he himself had been played. Jerome Davis found Gerald Watkins in February of 2017. He had been looking for him for 6 months, following a paper trail from one of the shell company filings that had Watkins's CPA license number embedded in a disclosure document that had been filed incorrectly. Jerome drove to Watkins's office on a Tuesday morning, a small accounting practice in a strip mall in Marietta, Georgia, and he walked in and sat down across from a man who had not slept well in a very long time. Jerome told me later that he could see it on the man immediately. He said Watkins looked like someone who had been carrying something so heavy for so long that his body had started to bend under the weight of it. Jerome set his briefcase on the desk, looked at Watkins and said quietly, "I know what she did, and I know you were part of it. Now you have a choice to make." Watkins stared at him for a long moment, and then, according to Jerome, he put his face in his hands and he started to cry. Not quietly, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere very deep, from a place that has been locked for a long time. Gerald Watkins cried for several minutes, and then he started talking. He talked for 4 hours. While Sandra Okoye was building the financial case from the outside, something was happening inside the scheme that Denise Williams had not anticipated. Gerald Watkins was not getting paid. In the months following Marcus's conviction, Denise had begun the process of moving the money she had accumulated through the shell companies into a series of offshore accounts, including one in the Cayman Islands that Watkins had been involved in establishing. The arrangement, as Watkins understood it, was that once the money was safely offshore and the legal dust from Marcus's conviction had settled, Denise would transfer his 15%, a figure that by that point represented approximately $4.5 million, into a separate account he controlled. He waited. He waited for months. The transfers never came. Denise's phone calls became infrequent. Then they stopped entirely. And Gerald Watkins, who had spent 3 years helping frame an innocent man for crimes that man never committed, began to understand that he himself had been played. Jerome Davis found Gerald Watkins in February of 2017. He had been looking for him for 6 months, following a paper trail from one of the shell company filings that had Watkins's CPA license number embedded in a disclosure document that had been filed incorrectly. Jerome drove to Watkins's office on a Tuesday morning, a small accounting practice in a strip mall in Marietta, Georgia, and he walked in and sat down across from a man who had not slept well in a very long time. Jerome told me later that he could see it on the man immediately. He said Watkins looked like someone who had been carrying something so heavy for so long that his body had started to bend under the weight of it. Jerome set his briefcase on the desk, looked at Watkins and said quietly, "I know what she did, and I know you were part of it. Now you have a choice to make." Watkins stared at him for a long moment, and then, according to Jerome, he put his face in his hands and he started to cry. Not quietly. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere very deep, from a place that has been locked for a long time. Gerald Watkins cried for several minutes, and then he started talking. He talked for 4 hours. At the same time that Jerome Davis was sitting across from a breaking man in a Marietta strip mall, something completely unconnected was happening in a small office building in Buckhead. A retired fraud investigator named Raymond Earl, 61 years old, 31 years with the Georgia Department of Revenue before he retired in 2015, was doing consulting work for a small regional bank that had flagged some unusual account activity for review. Raymond Earl was the kind of man who had spent 3 decades reading financial documents the way other people read novels, for the details that do not quite fit, for the sentence that does not flow naturally from the one before it, for the signature that carries itself just slightly differently than a signature should. He was going through a stack of flagged account records when he pulled the file for DLC Holdings, LLC, and found a signature on the account authorization documents. The signature was listed as Marcus Allen Williams. Raymond Earl had never met Marcus Williams, never heard of the man. But he had been reading signatures for 31 years, and something about this one was wrong. He could not immediately name the specific flaw, but in 31 years, his instincts about signatures had never failed him. He set the file aside, and then he started making calls. Raymond Earl contacted the Georgia Department of Banking and Finance. He contacted the IRS's Financial Crimes Tip Line. He got transferred, put on hold, and redirected more times than he could count. The federal case against Marcus Williams had already been decided. The man was in prison. The institutional momentum of that conviction made it extremely difficult for anyone inside the system to hear what Raymond was saying, because hearing it meant admitting the possibility that the system had gotten it catastrophically wrong. But Raymond Earl did not give up. He had a contact at the FBI's Atlanta field office, a woman named Agent Patricia Greer, who had worked financial crimes for 12 years and who had, over those 12 years, developed a healthy respect for Raymond Earl's instincts. When Raymond called Patricia Greer in March of 2017 and said, "Patricia, I need you to look at something," she listened. She pulled the DLC Holdings file. She looked at the signature, and then she made a call of her own to the Forensic Document Examination Unit in Quantico, Virginia. The results came back in 6 weeks. The signature on the DLC Holdings account authorization was a forgery. Highly skilled, practiced hundreds of times before being executed on the actual document. But a forgery. By the summer of 2017, 3 separate threads were converging on the same truth. Sandra Okoye and Jerome Davis had the shell company paper trail, the IP address records, and the fraudulent secondary accounting documents. Gerald Watkins had agreed to provide a full sworn affidavit detailing his role in the scheme and Denise's orchestration of it, in exchange for cooperation credit with federal prosecutors. And Raymond Earl and agent Patricia Greer had the forensic signature analysis confirming that Marcus Williams had not signed the documents that formed the foundation of his conviction. None of these 3 threads knew about the others yet, but they were all heading in the same direction. And Denise Williams, living in her Midtown penthouse, traveling to the Bahamas property she had purchased with Marcus's money, running the consulting firm she had quietly established in her own name after Marcus's conviction. Denise Williams did not know that any of this was happening. She had, as far as she was concerned, gotten away with it. She believed the story was over. She was wrong. Agent Patricia Greer brought the signature analysis results to her supervisor at the Atlanta field office in September of 2017. Her supervisor, a man named Special Agent in Charge David Holloway, 24 years with the Bureau, reviewed what she put on his desk and was quiet for a long time. Then he asked her one question. He said, "Is there more?" She told him there was. She told him about Jerome Davis and Sandra Okoye. She told him about Raymond Earl's banking records. She told him about Gerald Watkins's willingness to cooperate. David Holloway looked at the file on his desk for another long moment, and then he said 4 words that would change Marcus Williams' life. He said, "Open a new investigation." The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Atlanta began a formal reinvestigation of the Williams construction fraud case on September 18, 2017. This time, they were not investigating Marcus Williams. They were investigating Denise. Within 30 days of opening the investigation, federal agents had obtained warrants for Denise Williams's financial records going back 12 years. What they found confirmed everything that Jerome, Sandra, and Raymond had already pieced together, and then some. The 5 shell companies were fully documented. The Cayman Islands account containing just over $18 million was identified and frozen through a mutual legal assistance request. The Bahamas property, a 4-bedroom oceanfront home purchased in 2016 for $1.4 million, was seized. The offshore accounts that Denise had been using to move money through a chain of jurisdictions were traced by a Treasury Department financial intelligence analyst named Marcus Webb, who spent 3 weeks doing nothing but following the electronic signatures of $30 million as it moved through the global banking system. Every dollar led back to Williams Construction. Every transaction led back to Denise. The moment that truly broke the case open, the moment that shifted everything from possible to certain, came when Gerald Watkins sat down with federal prosecutors in October of 2017 and gave them everything. For 6 hours, Watkins walked investigators through the entire construction of the fraud, step by step, year by year. He explained how Denise had approached him in 2009, a full year before the first fraudulent transfer, and laid out a plan that was already fully formed. He described the creation of the shell companies, the development of the fraudulent accounting system, the careful selection and cultivation of Kevin Stills as a future false witness. He described the signature practice sessions, yes, you heard that correctly, sessions in which Denise had worked to perfect the replication of Marcus's signature over a period of months before ever using it on a real document. He described meetings in which Denise had discussed, in calm and specific terms, the likelihood that Marcus would be convicted and the timeline for moving the money to permanent offshore locations once that happened. Watkins also told investigators something that they had not known, something that added a dimension to this story that makes it almost impossible to fully absorb. He said that in the weeks before Marcus's arrest, Denise Williams had come to him with a specific question. She had asked him how long a man with Marcus's profile, first-time offender, no criminal history, respected in the community, would likely survive in federal prison given the sentence she anticipated. Watkins said he stared at her when she asked that question. He said he had understood from the beginning that they were framing Marcus. But in that moment, hearing her ask that question in that way, he said he realized that Denise Williams had been operating on the assumption that Marcus Williams was going to die in federal prison before anyone ever looked at any of this closely enough to find the truth. She was not trying to get him convicted and move on with her life. She had calculated, with what Watkins described as remarkable calm, that a man in his mid-50s entering a federal institution with no connections and no resources was unlikely to survive 22 years. She was betting on his death, and she had stolen $30 million to fund the life she was going to live on the other side of it. On November 19th, 2017, a Monday morning, federal agents went to Denise Williams's Midtown Atlanta penthouse. She opened the door in a silk robe, holding a coffee cup, and found Agent Patricia Greer and 3 additional federal agents standing in the hallway. She was charged with wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, perjury by proxy for her orchestration of Kevin Stills's false testimony, and obstruction of justice. She was taken into custody without incident. She did not cry. She did not speak except to ask that someone call her attorney. She was processed, photographed, and placed in the same county detention facility where Marcus Williams had spent 18 months before his trial. For the first time since this entire operation had begun, Denise Williams was on the wrong side of a locked door. That same week, Kevin Stills was arrested at his home in College Park, Georgia, and charged with perjury and conspiracy. He agreed to cooperate with prosecutors within 48 hours. Marcus Williams was in the General Population Unit of the Federal Correctional Institution in Jesup, Georgia, when his attorney, a wrongful conviction attorney named Carol Simmons, who had taken his case pro bono after being contacted by Jerome Davis, filed an emergency motion to vacate his conviction on November 22, 2017. The motion was supported by Gerald Watkins's sworn affidavit, the forensic signature analysis from Quantico, the FBI's financial investigation findings, Kevin Stills's recantation of his trial testimony, the IP address records placing the fraudulent transactions at Denise's computer and not Marcus's, and 37 additional exhibits that Sandra Okoye had compiled over 14 months. The motion landed on the desk of Federal District Judge Patricia Ann Hollins, a 28-year veteran of the federal judiciary who had seen a great deal in her career on the bench. Judge Hollins read the motion overnight. The following morning, she issued an emergency stay of Marcus Williams's sentence pending a full review of the conviction. 2 months later, on February 23, 2018, Judge Hollins vacated every count of Marcus Williams's conviction. Every single one. She wrote in her opinion, and I want you to hear the words of a federal judge here. She wrote that the evidence presented in this motion reveals a criminal conspiracy of extraordinary sophistication and duration, designed with the specific purpose of subverting the justice system to convict an innocent man. She wrote that the court is compelled to acknowledge not only the failure of the adversarial system in this case, but the extraordinary courage of the private individuals who refused to accept that failure as the final word. March 1st, 2018. Federal Correctional Institution, Jesup, Georgia. The sun is barely up. A corrections officer walks down a hallway in Unit C, stops at a particular cell, and turns a key. Marcus Allen Williams, 56 years old, 22 months inside a federal prison for crimes he never committed, picks up the single paper bag that holds everything he was permitted to keep, and he walks out of that cell for the last time. He does not run, he walks. Steady and deliberate, the way a man walks when he has spent nearly 2 years deciding who he is going to be when the door finally opens. He moves through the processing area, collects the belongings that were taken from him on the day he arrived, signs the paperwork that says he is a free man, and then he walks through the final set of doors into the Georgia morning air. Jerome Davis is in the parking lot. Jerome drove 6 hours the night before. He did not sleep. He parked outside the facility at 2 a.m. and sat in his car in the dark, waiting, the way you wait for something you have spent every day of 7 years working toward. When Marcus came through those doors, Jerome said later, he did not know whether to shout or fall to his knees. He said he did neither. He said he just stood there by the car with his hands in his jacket pockets and let Marcus walk to him. They held each other in that parking lot for a long time. Jerome said neither of them said anything for the first several minutes. There was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying better. There were no cameras in that parking lot. No press release had been issued. No one from the U.S. Attorney's Office that had prosecuted Marcus in 2015 was present. No one from the federal system that had held him for 22 months sent a representative to acknowledge what had been done to him. It was just Marcus Williams and Jerome Davis in a parking lot outside a federal prison in rural Georgia at sunrise, driving away from the worst chapter of their lives in Jerome's 12-year-old Ford pickup. Marcus said later that as they drove away, he looked out the passenger window at the pine trees going by, and for the first time in almost 2 years, he let himself cry. Not for the lost time, not for the anger. He said he cried because he was still here, because he had not broken, because everything Denise had calculated, everything she had wagered on, had been wrong. He was still here, and he was going home. Denise Williams' federal trial began on October 8, 2018, in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. The same court, the same building, the same hallways where Marcus had been convicted 3 years earlier. The symmetry was not lost on anyone who was paying attention. The prosecution's case against Denise was, in a word, complete. They had the shell companies, they had the forged signatures, they had the fraudulent accounting records, they had Gerald Watkins, who testified for 2 full days and walked the jury through every element of the scheme with the kind of terrible, specific detail that only a participant could provide. They had Kevin Stills, who took the stand and told the jury that everything he had said at Marcus's trial was a lie, that he had been paid $15,000 in cash by Denise Williams to fabricate his testimony. They had the IP address records. They had the Cayman Islands account. They had the Bahamas property deed. They had the testimony of Treasury analyst Marcus Webb, who spent 3 hours showing the jury exactly how $30 million had been moved, layered, and hidden across 5 countries and 11 financial institutions. Denise Williams' defense team argued that she had acted under Marcus's direction, that she was a loyal employee and wife who had been manipulated into participating in schemes she did not fully understand, that the shell companies were Marcus's idea, that the forged signatures were hers only because Marcus had instructed her to sign on his behalf, which he allegedly did frequently. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, 9 of them black, 3 white, deliberated for 4 hours and 20 minutes. They returned with 17 guilty verdicts. Denise Williams was convicted on all counts. Her sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later. The judge, reviewing the full scope of what Denise had done, the years of planning, the false witness, the calculated attempt to ensure Marcus would die in prison before the truth could emerge, sentenced Denise Laverne Williams to 26 years in federal prison, 4 years more than the sentence she had engineered for her husband. Gerald Watkins received 11 years, with credit for his cooperation. Kevin Stills received 7 years. Denise Williams was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, through the same hallways where Marcus had walked 3 years earlier, past the same marble pillars and heavy wooden doors. She did not look back. The federal court ordered the return of all recoverable assets to Marcus Williams as restitution. Of the $30 million Denise had stolen, approximately $11 million was recovered from the Cayman Islands account, the sale of the Bahamas property, and various domestic accounts that had been frozen. The remaining $19 million had been spent, transferred to locations that proved impossible to fully trace, or dissipated through the process of moving money across multiple jurisdictions. 11 million sounds like a significant amount of money, and it is, but $11 million, by the time legal fees were paid, back taxes were addressed, and the costs of rebuilding a business from nothing at the age of 56 were factored in, did not put Marcus Williams back where he was. It could not. You cannot put a dollar figure on 22 months inside a federal prison. You cannot write a check that covers the experience of watching your company get seized, your bank accounts frozen, your children stop returning your calls. You cannot fully compensate a man for the years his mother spent believing the world had decided her son was a criminal. Marcus Williams started a new company in 2019, smaller than what he had before. 8 employees at the start. Honest, careful, deliberate work, the same way he had always worked, just with less infrastructure and more scar tissue. He said in a rare public statement that he gave in 2020 that he was not interested in trying to rebuild what he had lost. He was interested in building something new, something that belonged entirely to who he was now and what he knew now. He said the man who walked out of FCI Jesup on March 1st, 2018, was not the same man who had walked into it. He said he was not sure that was entirely a bad thing, but he said the cost of that transformation was one that no man should ever have to pay. His children, Marcus Jr. and Aaliyah, reconciled with him within the first year after his release. His youngest, Christopher, who had been 19 at the time of the arrest and had spent 4 formative years believing his father was guilty. That relationship, Marcus said, was still being rebuilt, slowly, carefully, one conversation at a time. In the spring of 2020, Marcus Williams received a letter. It came through his attorney's office, forwarded from the Federal Correctional Institution where Denise was serving her sentence. It was written by hand, 14 pages. Marcus has never shared the contents publicly. He has spoken about it in only one context, in a brief interview he gave to a small Atlanta-based podcast in the fall of 2021, and what he said was this. He said, "She told the truth in that letter. Finally, all of it. And I forgave her, not for her sake, for mine. Because I decided a long time ago that the only way I was going to survive what she did to me was to refuse to carry it. I put it down. I am still here. She is where she is, and I am still here." Those are his words. From a man who lost $30 million, 22 months of his freedom, nearly his relationship with his children, and the business that he built from $12,000 and 30 years of his life. He put it down. I am still here. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because what Marcus Williams chose to do with his anger is as remarkable as anything else in this story. And it raises a question that I want to leave with you. Whether justice was truly served in this case, whether what happened to Denise Williams adequately accounts for what she took from Marcus and from his family and from everyone who trusted and believed in him, that is a question you are going to have to answer for yourself, because I honestly do not know. I know the law was eventually applied correctly. I know the people responsible are in prison. But I also know that Marcus Williams, at 56 years old, had to start his life over from scratch. I also know that $19 million of his money is gone and will never be recovered. I also know that a federal jury convicted him unanimously in 2015 on evidence that was entirely fabricated, and that the system did not catch that on its own. It took a retired accountant with a hunch, an old friend who refused to quit, and a private investigator spending her life savings to prove what the government could not be bothered to see. And I find that I cannot tell you that is justice. I can tell you it is better than what it was. But I am not sure that is the same thing. I want you to think about something before you close this video. Jerome Davis, the man who spent $312,000 of his own savings, who drove through the night to stand in a federal prison parking lot at sunrise, who never for one single moment stopped believing that his friend was innocent. Jerome Davis was not a lawyer. He was not a private investigator. He was not connected to the justice system in any official capacity. He was a man from Southeast Atlanta who had known Marcus Williams since they were both 12 years old, and who understood that loyalty is not just a feeling, it is a practice. It is a choice you make every single morning, especially on the mornings when making it costs you something. Raymond Earl was a retired government employee who noticed something wrong with a signature on a piece of paper that crossed his desk on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. He had no obligation to Marcus Williams. He had never met the man. He had no personal stake in what happened. But he had 31 years of expertise, and he had the integrity to follow what that expertise was telling him, even when the institutions he contacted did not want to hear it. These two men, one who knew Marcus for 40 years, one who never knew him at all, are the reason Marcus Williams is free today. Not the justice system, not the FBI, not the US Attorney's Office. Two private citizens who refuse to accept a wrong outcome. So here is the question I want to leave in your comments tonight. I want you to think honestly, and I want you to tell me, if Marcus Williams had been your father, your brother, your best friend, if you were the one watching someone you loved get taken from you by the justice system and everyone around you was telling you to accept it, to move on, to let it go, would you have done what Jerome Davis did? Would you have spent everything you had for years on the chance that the truth might come out? Or would the weight of it eventually have broken you? I genuinely want to know. Leave it in the comments. Because this is not an abstract question. Every single day in this country, there are people sitting in federal and state prisons for crimes they did not commit. Some of them have a Jerome Davis. Most of them do not. And the ones who do not, their stories never get told. Think about that.